Paige didn't believe WWE would clear her until WrestleMania 42 return. She thought it was over. Not temporarily, not maybe, but completely over. And that belief shaped everything leading into one of the most unexpected moments at WrestleMania 42. Because when Paige made her return on that stage, helping Brie Bella capture the WWE Women's Tag Team titles, fans saw a surprise. What they didn't see was the doubt that came before it. And that's what makes this story matter. It wasn't just a comeback. It was a moment that, even in her own mind, wasn't supposed to happen. Days after WrestleMania 42, Paige shared footage from April 21, 2026. It captured the exact moment she found out she had been medically cleared by WWE. And instead of confidence or expectation, what came through immediately was relief. Real, unfiltered relief. She admitted that leading up to that decision, she genuinely believed WWE would never allow her back in the ring. Not eventually. Not under the right circumstances. Just never. And that changes how we look at her entire return. Because when a performer steps into a WrestleMania moment, especially one tied to championship stakes, there's usually a level of preparation, expectation, and long-term planning behind it. But in this case, the foundation was uncertainty. Paige described being overwhelmed with emotion the moment she got the news. Not just happy, but almost shaken by it. She talked about how long the road had been, and how much effort it took just to get to that point mentally and physically. She referenced her struggles, her efforts to rebuild her life, and the importance of surrounding herself with the right people. That context matters, because it tells us this wasn't just a medical clearance. It was the end of a very long internal battle. And then there's the fear she revealed. She said she was stressing, convinced there was no way WWE would clear her to wrestle again. That level of doubt isn't casual. That's the kind of mindset that comes from years of being told, directly or indirectly, that something might no longer be possible. So when fans saw her walk down that ramp at WrestleMania 42, what they were really seeing was someone stepping into a moment she didn't think she would ever get back. And that brings us to the match itself. The situation unfolded quickly. Nikki Bella suffered an ankle injury, creating an unexpected opening in the women's tag team title match. That alone would have changed the dynamic. But what followed was something few could have predicted. Paige stepped in. No long build. No weeks of teasing. Just a sudden shift that immediately raised the stakes and the curiosity around the match. Could she still go? Would she be protected in the ring? How would WWE handle the situation? Instead, she didn't just participate. She contributed to the outcome. Teaming with Brie Bella, she helped secure the victory and the titles. From a storytelling perspective, it worked. From a real-life perspective, it carried far more weight than most viewers realized at the time. Because behind that performance was someone who had been shaking with anxiety, just waiting for a decision. Paige even described how she felt physically in that moment before getting cleared. She said she was stressed to the point of shaking, unable to relax until she heard the final word. And once she did, it wasn't celebration right away. It was the ability to breathe again. That detail stands out. It tells us that the pressure wasn't about performing at WrestleMania. It was about whether performing was even an option anymore. And when you look at it through that lens, her return becomes less about the surprise and more about the journey. What makes this particularly interesting is how it reshapes the narrative of her WrestleMania appearance. Initially, it came across as a creative pivot due to an injury, a replacement, albeit a notable one. But now, with this added context, it feels more like a moment that had been quietly building behind the scenes, even if Paige herself didn't believe it would reach this point. There's also something to be said about timing. WrestleMania is the biggest stage in WWE. Returns there are often calculated, designed to maximize reaction and impact. But in this case, The timing wasn't just about audience reaction. It was tied to circumstance, opportunity, and a last-minute shift that opened the door. And Paige walked through it, not with certainty, but with a mixture of relief and disbelief. That emotional layer is what separates this return from others, because it wasn't framed as redemption. It wasn't presented as dominance. It was simply a return, grounded in reality, shaped by doubt, and defined by the fact that it almost didn't happen at all. From an analytical standpoint, this raises questions about what comes next. When a return is built on overcoming uncertainty, the follow-up becomes crucial. Do you continue that story? Do you integrate her into regular competition? Or do you preserve the moment by limiting appearances? There's no clear answer yet, and that's part of what makes this situation compelling. Paige has already crossed the biggest hurdle, which was being cleared. But stepping back into a consistent in-ring role is a different challenge entirely. It involves trust, both from the company and from the performer herself. And based on her own words, that trust wasn't something she assumed she would get. Another layer to consider is how this impacts audience perception. Fans initially reacted to the surprise. Now, they have the context. They know the doubt, the stress, the emotional weight behind that moment. And that knowledge can shift how they view her going forward. It creates a deeper connection, but it also raises expectations. Not necessarily in terms of performance, but in terms of storytelling. Because when a real-life journey like this becomes part of the narrative, it's difficult to separate the two. Every appearance carries that history with it. And WWE will need to decide how much of that they want to acknowledge moving forward. Do they lean into it? Or do they treat WrestleMania 42 as a standalone moment? Paige's comments also highlight something that often goes unnoticed in wrestling. The waiting, the uncertainty between decisions, the lack of control performers sometimes have over their own careers. It's easy to focus on what happens in the ring. But moments like this remind us that some of the most significant battles happen outside of it. Waiting to be cleared, waiting for approval, waiting to find out if something you've built your life around is still possible. That's where this story resonates the most. Because it's not just about wrestling. It's about doubt, persistence, and the moment when something shifts. And in this case, that shift happened just in time for WrestleMania. Looking back, it's interesting to think about how close this came to not happening. If Nikki Bella doesn't get injured, the opportunity may not have presented itself in the same way. If the decision takes longer, the timing doesn't align. There are multiple variables that had to fall into place. And yet, from Paige's perspective, none of that mattered until she got the confirmation. That's the core of this story. Not the match, not the titles, but the moment she realized that what she thought was impossible was suddenly real again. And that's something fans couldn't see until now. It adds depth to her return, but it also adds complexity to her future. Because now that she's back, the question isn't just whether she can wrestle. It's how often she should. Should WWE build around her return and integrate her into ongoing storylines? Or should they treat this as a special moment? Something that doesn't need to be repeated frequently to retain its impact? There's a balance to be found. And that balance will likely depend on both her comfort level and WWE's long-term plans. What's clear is that her WrestleMania 42 appearance wasn't just another return. It was the result of a long, uncertain process that nearly ended differently. And knowing that changes everything, it reframes the moment, not as a surprise for the audience, but as a breakthrough for the person involved. So now the focus shifts forward, not just to what Paige can do in the ring, but to how WWE chooses to present her moving ahead. Because the story has already been told once. The comeback happened. The question now is what comes after that. And maybe more importantly, whether continuing the story adds to it, or risks taking away from what made it meaningful in the first place. So with all that in mind, there's one question that really stands out. Do you think Paige's WrestleMania 42 return should lead to a full-time comeback? Or should WWE keep her appearances limited to preserve the impact of that moment?